Hey, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Laura Miller, and today's talk is sponsored by the Eiichi Shibusawa Seigo Arai Endowed Professorship in Japanese Studies and UMSL Global at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So I'd like to introduce briefly our invited speaker today, and we're very pleased to have Dr. Akiko Walley. She's the Maude Kerns Associate Professor of Japanese Art at the University of Oregon. She received her PhD from Harvard University, and she's the author of the book, Constructing the Dharma King, the Horyuji Shaka Triad and the Birth of the Prince Shōtoku Cult, published by Brill in 2015. And Professor Walley is currently working on a new book that investigates early Buddhist relic devotion in Japan and focuses on the performative nature of Buddhist reliquaries. And today she'll talk about a famous series of Buddhist prayers that were commissioned by the female emperor Shōtoku. So if you have, as we go along, if you have questions or towards the end, because it's a webinar, please use the Q&A function, or you can also type your questions in the chat, and I'll try to monitor both of these. So please join me in welcoming Professor Akiko Walley. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to present today. And thank you for everybody on the attendee side for joining us today. The piece I will be discussing, I will be introducing is one of what is known as Hyakumantō or Hyakumantō Darani, which translates to 1 million pagodas and Buddhist incantations. This piece is one of the newest acquisitions of the University of Oregon, where I work. And we are very pleased, and I particularly, this was a piece that I have been wanting to acquire for our collection for a very long time. And it was made possible by support of multiple institutions and funds. One of the special aspects of this piece that I will be mentioning a little bit more later on in the presentation is the printed incantation, as you see at the bottom, which is the oldest datable print in the world at the moment. And this acquisition was made to complement the university's strong collection of Japanese prints. And I wanted to mention a little bit about the background for the acquisition of this work and how it fits into my own work at the moment. This acquisition also relates to the project I launched in 2019 as part of the 2-year collaboration initiative that was spearheaded by University of Oregon's Library and the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art, which is our university museum, to better integrate the resources available at the two institutions. And this initiative was carried out with the generous support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And as part of this initiative, I researched over 300 calligraphy fragments in the University of Oregon collection. One set is in the special collections and university archives at the library, and the other in the museum. And this project culminated in a virtual exhibition, Tekagami and Kyogire, which you see the link to on the screen. And I continued my research last year as a Getty Scholar, and based on the findings, I am presently teaching a seminar on the art of writing in Japan. So the presentation today will be focused on the calligraphic nature of the printed incantation. And I will try to position it within the religio-political circumstances of the 8th century Japan. So the set of the object is called 1 million pagodas because there were literally 1 million of them produced. Very rare for an 8th century artwork. We can trace the production of these pagoda through contemporaneous documents. According to the Chronicle of Japan Continued, or Shoku Nihongi, after she successfully neutralized a coup d'etat by her kin called Fujiwara no Nakamaro, Empress Shōtoku vowed to construct 1 million 3-story pagodas, each of which contained a short incantation, or darani, from the sutra called the Great Darani of the Pure Immaculate Light. When they were finished, finally in 770, the pagoda were donated to multiple temples. The incantation on the inscriptions on some of the pagoda corroborate this record. Many of the pagodas did not survive the test of time, but over 45,000 pagodas and about 4,000 darani still remain in the temple called Horyuji in Nara Prefecture, Japan. And what you are seeing in the background of this slide is the setup of Hyakumantō display in the Horyuji Temple Museum. And you can see, these little ones towards the bottom, and there are 2 that are taller. So what people believe to have happened was, in addition to the 3-story pagoda, of which there were 1 million, for every 10,000 small pagodas, the 3-story one, a large 7-story pagoda was created to sort of mark the milestone. And for every 100,000, the largest 13-story pagoda was made. So the U of O example is that of a 3-story pagoda, and it is about 21.6 centimeter in height and about 9.5 centimeter in diameter. And the pagoda comes in 2 parts. First is the body, which mimics a 3-story structure. And a cylindrical niche was drilled into the main part of the body from the top to store the darani. The second is the finial, which also served the pragmatic function of a stopper. The body was typically made of Japanese cypress, while the finial was made of varying woods, including sakaki, cherry, and sandalwood. The finial beautifully replicates the architectural components of a Buddhist pagoda, with 7 so-called flower-receiving discs and an adornment at the top in the shape of a precious wish-granting jewel. The darani was printed onto yellow-tinted mulberry paper in black ink, then cut into a hand scroll-like strip of about 43.1 centimeter by 6.4 centimeter. Each pagoda came with one of 4 different types of incantations taken from the same scripture. The one in the pagoda of the University of Oregon is called the Darani of the Seal of One's Own Mind. And there are 5 characters per line and 31 lines total. Additional rectangular paper was affixed as the frontispiece. Originally, the miniature scroll would have been wrapped in yet another paper and placed inside the body of the pagoda, as you see here. This, unfortunately, is from a different pagoda, but I'm sort of presenting to give an example of how it looked like. So the fact that the incantation is printed is significant. Although the practice of printmaking was most likely introduced to the Japanese archipelago from China and the Korean peninsula, the Hyakumantō darani are the oldest datable prints known in the world today. So the physical traits of the pagodas, as well as the archaeological findings, tell us that the body and the finial were each produced from a single wood using a wood lathe. According to Narita Juichiro's calculation, in order to complete 1 million pagodas in 5 years, the artisans had to make about 700 pagodas per day. Each lathe station would have required a carver and 2 assistants to turn the lathe. Narita estimates a carver could have reasonably produced about 5 pagodas per day, requiring the work. So this calculates to a workshop of 140 lathe and 420 workers per day, requiring the workspace of at least 840 square meters. It would have been an imperially operated monumental project employing the state-of-the-art technology. So how is it that such a historically precious piece can now reside in the University of Oregon collection? The provenance of our Hyakumantō is virtually identical to any Hyakumantō presently in private or public collections. Our piece is accompanied by a wooden box with inscription done in ink at the front and top, recording one of the Hyakumantō from Horyuji. Horyuji is a Buddhist temple in Nara Prefecture, about 20 minutes southwest of the present Nara city by train. It was originally built in the first half of the 7th century and subsequently rebuilt in the early 8th century after its building suffered a catastrophic fire in 670 CE. The main image hall, 5-story pagoda, and the central gateway are the oldest timber frame architecture in the world. So this is the view of the West Precinct, which is the main sanctuary for this temple compound. And this is in north-south axis. And this is the central gateway and the 5-story pagoda and the main image hall called Kondo, or the Golden Hall. And the lecture hall is positioned towards the back or the south. So the temple enjoyed patronage from the emperor's powerful court and warrior officials throughout its history. However, in the process of modernization beginning in the latter half of the 19th century, there was a government-led campaign to, quote, abolish Buddhism and destroy Buddhist images, or Haibutsu Kishaku, that put many prestigious Buddhist institutions, including Horyuji, in a financial dire strait. According to the contemporaneous record, Horyuji was in such a disarray at that time that local villagers came to tie their livestock on, temple posts, while children's favorite pastime was to sneak up to the 2nd story of the central gateway, where many of the Hyakumantō and Darani were stored. And they would jump over the miniature pagoda, stump them into pieces, and make a bonfire with the printed Darani to admire the pretty fire. So it's actually remarkable the central gateway did not burn down. So it was in a very terrible condition. So in 1908, Horyuji solicited donation to repair its buildings and also to pay off some debt. As commemorative gifts to the donors, the temple planned to give out 3,000 of the Hyakumantō from its collection. The U of O piece is accompanied by a certificate confirming that it was indeed gifted to commemorate a donation of 35 Japanese yen, which converts to about $7,000 today. And if you look at the certificate, so here in the large character, it says 1 million pagoda, and in a smaller character, and 1 pagoda, right? And in a smaller character, it says accompanied by the sutra or the Darani. And here, the amount of the donation is written in ink. Everything else is kind of printed. And also the date is also inked in. And here would have been where the name of the donor, whoever received this pagoda, would have been, but it's cut out, most likely when the pagoda was sold to a dealer. The process by which this donation was executed is well documented because Horyuji needed to request an approval from the governor of Nara Prefecture, who in return had to receive approval from the Federal Bureau of Internal Affairs. The government considered Hyakumantō a historical treasure, thus ordered the temple to prioritize the educational institutions, then use whatever was left to solicit donation from private individuals. There were 4 tiers to the donation amount, which correlate to the quality of the pagoda and darani a donor received in return. The highest tier was 35 yen, which would have gotten a donor an undamaged pagoda and undamaged darani. So this is the printed tier, an explanation that was sent out to people. And it says, this is the part that says 35 yen. It's the top tier, first tier. And it indicates that it is only limited to 100 pagodas. And it says 1 pagoda with 3-story intact, as well as the finial. And also it says the sutra or the darani, a complete version. And the other tier, it goes down to 25 yen, 20 yen, and 15 yen. And, this amount may seem small from today's perspective, but as I mentioned, it sort of calculates to $7,000 today. And the contemporaneous record mentions that the top tier is way too expensive. And, I wanted to donate, but I couldn't. So the fact that the certificate for the University of Oregon Hyakumantō says 35 yen most likely means that the insect damage we see on the darani was caused sometime after the pagoda left the temple. The fundraising effort was so successful that Horyuji achieved the target amount of 30,000 yen with just 962 pagodas. The temple continued to periodically give out Hyakumantō in return for patronage and donation until the last donation campaign that happened in 1947. I mentioned earlier that the printed scroll inside the pagoda is an incantation from the great darani of the pure, immaculate light. This scripture was translated in 704 into Chinese during the first half of the 8th century, so 704. This scripture was very much the vogue in East Asia when Shōtoku embarked on her unprecedented project. The sutra is short with a relatively straightforward plot. A divination master tells a wealthy man that his life is about to end and a terrible, terrible fate awaits him in the afterlife. He comes to the Buddha to seek help, who teaches him a set of powerful incantations that prolong life and guarantee protection from the guardian deities. The sutra includes 6 different daranis. 4 out of the 6 are selected for the Hyakumantō project. The Buddhist incantations are Chinese transliteration of Sanskrit original. So they were meant to be recited, but tracing the sound orally or through reading will not convey what they mean. I found 2 YouTube videos that chant the darani that is included in the Oregon Hyakumantō. The first one is what I gathered to be a reconstruction of original Sanskrit. The Sanskrit version of the sutra does not remain today. And the second is a Chinese pronunciation of the incantation, which again is purely phonetic, conveying no meaning at all. So let's listen to them.
Namo Bhagavate Navanavatinam Samyak Sambuddha Koti Nayuta Shata Sahasranam Namaha Sarva Nivarana Vishkambhine Bauthi Sattvaya Om Turu Turu Sarvam Varana Vishodhani Sarvatadhakatayur Palani Vipule Nirmale Sarva Siddha Namaskrite Bhara Bhara Sarva Sattva Valokini Hum sarva nivarana vishkambhini sarva papa vishodhani swaha。
世尊，此陀罗尼是99亿诸佛所说。
So next one is the Chinese transliteration, pronounced.
60页，请各位看到这个咒语，如果你愿意念，也可以很快成佛。59页，我先念吧，来跟我念：南无波揭法帝，南婆南瓦帝那，三藐三佛陀，居之那，伊多舍多娑，赫萨那那，南无萨婆尼瓦拉，努比舍见，比尼菩提萨埵耶，嗡嘟噜嘟噜，萨婆阿瓦那鲁，毗苏达尼，萨婆丹他揭罗，摩依波持尼，毗婆利尼，摩尼萨婆悉多，南无塞奇利地，巴拉巴拉，萨婆萨多，波罗揭尼，嗡萨婆尼，瓦那鲁，毗舍坚比尼，萨婆波婆，毗烧达尼，说哈。好，解释一下。
So the first one, the one that recreated the Sanskrit sound, I included a little bit of the main narrative portion of the sutra, so you can kind of hear the difference in sound. And the Chinese one too, because it's transliteration, pronounced Chinese way, it doesn't sound very much Sanskrit-ish, but still you can tell that there are certain sounds that are a little bit more similar to the recreated version. And as you heard, there is a kind of a rhythmic quality to the incantation. And in fact, the printed Dharani also reproduces the notation original to the translated sutra that indicate the pitch when they are read aloud. For an object from 8th century, Hyakumantō has an amazing amount of documentation that can be corroborated through archaeological findings and also inscription of the pagodas themselves. Yet the actual context of production or the full scope of the project's impact is still very much a mystery. For instance, for the Dharani, despite significant scholarly attention, we still do not know whether the prints were done using woodblock or metal plates. Why were only 4 out of the 6 Dharani selected for this project? Why were they printed? The scripture is explicit about either chanting or copying the Dharani by hand. And considering that Shōtoku had the entire imperial scriptorium at her disposal, there would not have been any compelling need to print the incantations if she were to be faithful to the original text. The fact that no record exists of a grand dedicatory ceremony upon the project's completion prompted some scholars to speculate if the project was considered at the time to be a failure or even an embarrassment. There is even a question concerning the calligraphic quality of the printed Dharani, because at first glance, one could perceive a certain sense of immaturity in form. I do not yet have the answers to many of the above questions. This is very much a new project. However, I believe the last question of calligraphic quality could provide an interesting perspective into the production process and the project's place within Shōtoku's religio-political agenda. But before we move further with the discussion, let us look closer to the University of Oregon printed darani. The incantation scroll inside the University of Oregon Hyakumantō comes with 29 lines with 2 additional lines at the beginning with the title of the sutra and the name of the darani. Each line has 5 characters, as I mentioned earlier. Consistent with other examples, the scroll did not come with any roller. The frontispiece and the beginning portion of the scroll has insect damage. This is kind of commonly seen in this set of objects, but the remainder of the scroll is in good condition. The inking is somewhat uneven at places. The characters with darker ink generally appear around the top and bottom of the scroll. So it is estimated that the printing was first done on a large size paper, which was then cut into the hand scroll shape. Why do we know this? We know this because some of the darani, like the one in University of Oregon collection, have few characters at the bottom of the scroll partially cut off, just a tiny bit at the bottom cut off. While other include parts of the characters of the incantation that was printed immediately above. So this is to show an example, not to suggest that this piece from University of Oregon was actually above this piece that I pulled from a book, but a similar case of sort of almost like a careless or careless cutting, I suppose, happened in many of the incantation. So the way that people speculate at the moment, due to the amount of space that would have been between the one incantation and the next, the plate, either woodblock or metal, was placed affixed on a surface, and the paper was moved to make multiple printing, rather than having a big plate with or woodblock with multiple carvings of the incantation. At places, particularly at the bottom of the scroll, one can find evidence of sideway drag marks and smudging, possibly caused due to the coarseness of the paper or lack of registration. Inking on most characters, on the other hand, appears somewhat faint, which suggests that there was only one round of printing. The verso provides very little information on printing method. The Yuvo Darani shows few areas where ink appears on the back, as you can see here. However, when we superimpose the verso onto the recto, like so, it becomes clear that the ink spots are not evidence of ink from the front side seeping through, but more like accidental smudging caused during the printing process. Calligraphically, the characters generally appear rounded around the edges, giving a soft impression. There are variation in hand across remaining examples, indicating that multiple people were involved in producing the relief woodblock on metal or metal plate. And we already know that at least 8 plates were used, and there could have been more. To begin the analysis of calligraphic quality on the darani print, it is helpful to know that there are actually 3 examples of handwritten darani found among the Hyakumantō that remain in Horyuji. Although the 3 handwritten examples are heavily damaged, they retain enough to tell us that, number 1, unlike the printed counterpart, the handwritten ones used ruled lines and included 6 characters per line instead of 5. That means these are not the originals, right, to create either woodblock or the metal plate. And 2, they were produced by the scribes working for the Imperial Scriptorium. We have some that comes with a name. The handwritten darani exhibit the calligraphic style consistent with the standard script used in the Nara period sutra copying at the Imperial Scriptorium. Each character is well balanced. The clearly defining beginning and end of a stroke, particularly for horizontal and vertical lines, and where the brush turns, give the impression of sharpness, quite contrary to the gentleness characteristic to the printed darani. And here I am talking about the corners such as this, and the last flick of the brush towards the end, and a clear definition of lines, as you can see here, and a sharp line, particularly going horizontally. So certain differences in details may speak to the method in which the relief block or plate was prepared. For instance, when we compare the character ba that we see here, we realize that the horizontal stroke for the bottom half of the character, which is drawn sharply and straight through in a single movement in the handwritten darani, seems to be broken into two strokes at the middle in the printed counterpart. So this is the stroke, as you can see, that I'm talking about. And for the printed one, there seems to be a small break in the line at the very center, like so. The type of break in stroke is something one might observe in an inscription incised onto a metal, such as as the example from the 7th century Lotus Sutra tableau at Hasedera. This possible connection to preceding metal inscriptions is intriguing because it provides us with an alternate point of comparison. So this might be a little bit hard to see, but there is a clear one stroke and there is another. And knowing that this is created using a chisel, it's probably the case that one stroke went from left-hand side and the other stroke perhaps made from the opposite side that meets at the center. Not only that the metal inscribing technology in Japan was high enough already at the end of the 7th century, particularly at the center of the Yamato polity. As far as we can tell from the most accomplished inscriptions on Buddhist bronze statues of the period, such as the one from the Hasedera, the aesthetic drive seemed to have been to imitate the brushed calligraphy as much as possible. In the case of the Hasedera Lotus Sutra tableau, the powerful beginning and end of a stroke, sharp turns at the corner, or the flick at the end of a final vertical stroke all replicate the calligraphic brushstroke compellingly using a chisel. Certain details in the printed darani suggest that if the same sort of imitation of the contemporaneous standard calligraphic mode of sutra copying was a concern, perhaps there was already the technical know-how to achieve it. If this was indeed the case, then we must explore further the presence of an alternate motivation behind the calligraphic choice we see in the printed Hyakumantō darani. Besides the Hyakumantō darani, the next earliest prints in Japan do not appear until the 11th century. However, the concept and technology of mechanically replicating patterns, images, and objects had been around on the Japanese archipelago at least by the 3rd century CE. When bronze mirrors made domestically began to circulate across the mainland. Even though we are uncertain of the material used, it is reasonable to assume that the Hyakumantō darani were produced using a relief printing technique. Some materials commonly used in the Nara period to produce something in relief form would have been, as you see here, clay, wood, and metal. Considering the sheer number of prints that the project needed to generate, a wood block or metal plate would have been a reasonable choice. And one example that I have not mentioned too much is the seal carving. So what you're seeing here is a detail of an imperially generated document that has this imperial seal, very impressive imperial seal all over. But for the imperial seal, the material could have been stone, but most likely more precious material, including ivory or marble, which would not have been used in other instances of tools to mechanically replicate an image or object. And another case would be stamping, right, or stenciling on textile. Among the techniques used to produce relief text rather than image, I believe the most intriguing for our purpose are the coins. The concept of currency was an import from China and the Korean Peninsula. In Japan, coins were made and circulated at least by the beginning of the 8th century. Directly related to the topic at hand, in 765, while the Hyakumantō project was underway, Empress Shōtoku issued a new currency in an effort to stabilize the inflation caused by Nakamura's coup and also severe famine. Coins issued in Japan up to this point, including Shōtoku's were all modeled after the Chinese coin, Kai Yuan Tongbao, which is what you see here. First issued in 621 CE and continued to be in circulation through the Tang Dynasty. For this coin, prominent Tang calligrapher Ouyang Shun, designed the script based on the archaic Li Shu style. Although compared to Wado Kaiqing and Mannen Tsuho, issued in 706 and 760, respectively, the calligraphy on Empress Shōtoku's Jinku Kaiho coins was not as strictly Li Shu style, but it still retained some of its flavor. So the Li Shu style, it's a style that became prominent in Han Dynasty, so 2nd century or so, 2nd century BCE to 2nd century CE. And it was more of a simplified format of another calligraphic mode that was prevalent at that time. But the characteristic of it is this kind of almost like a wavy line that uses very stylized line, quite beautiful. And the place you see the most relationship in terms of Jinku Kaiho, the Shōtoku's coin, is the last character treasure or ho. That is, you can see in some of the earlier coins too. The strokes seem to move outward in almost like a rectangular way, very dynamic, and it has this kind of soft appearance. When we return to Hyakumantō Darani, the impression of softness that comes from the curvy corners and rounded stroke ends is aesthetically much closer to the Li Shu or Li Shu inspired script selected for the contemporaneous coins than the sharp standard script used for sutra copying. And you can see a little bit of the waviness in some of the strokes. And there are few that are actually direct, because the characters are so few, direct comparison. But you can see the similarity in the aesthetic drive. With regard to the certain level of casualness we find in the printing itself, such as the smudging or pooling of ink, crookedness of the printing, or the crookedness of the cutting, which from today's perspective may appear somewhat messy, is in fact in keeping with the preceding and contemporaneous attitude generally toward production of objects that were meant to be hidden from the devotee's view. The stark contrast between the nonchalant printing of darani, perceivably, and the incredible precision and care given to the wooden pagoda, in one sense proves that the incantations were never intended for human eyes. Returning to the question of aesthetic merit of the Hyakumantō darani, though, the point of comparison may need to be adjusted somewhat to fully appreciate the potential intent of the selection and the effect achieved by the outcome. But at the same time, it is important to underscore that the connection to the mode of relief calligraphy found in coins that I propose today still does not necessarily get us closer to identifying the exact method of printing technique employed. Although the process of minting coins appears to be readily adaptable to the production of metal plates for the Hyakumantō darani printing, it is also theoretically possible to adapt just the calligraphic style and produce woodblock for the actual printing. So the potential connection between the Hyakumantō and Shōtoku's new coins, however, helps us position both of these projects within the Empress's broader religio-political concerns. Empress Shōtoku was one of the 6 female sovereigns who ruled from the 6th to the 8th century. In East Asia, a female ruler was extremely rare, and Japan was no exception. Among the 126 generations of emperors, including the mythical ones, there are only 2 other female sovereigns, both of whom ascended to the throne in the early modern period. So, Shōtoku was unorthodox, even among the few empresses within the history of Yamato polity. Typically, the only time when a queen consort or an imperial princess ascended to the throne was during a political crisis. For instance, when there is no male heir of suitable age, a woman may step in as an empress in an effort to retain the imperial blood lineage until the prince heir matures to take the throne. So for example, if you go over some of the other empresses preceding Koken, or Shōtoku, Koken, Princess Abe, they're all the same person. Princess Abe ascended to throne as Koken first, and then conceded and reasserted the throne as Shōtoku in 764. So that's why the division. But for instance, Suiko, she was the daughter of an emperor named Kinmei, and she was also the wife of another emperor named Bitatsu. But after her husband Bitatsu's death, there was a bit of a political struggle, and the emperor who ascended to throne was assassinated by one of the most prestigious family of courtiers at that time. So that happened in 592. And in order to preserve the blood lineage and prevent further political turmoil, Suiko stepped in as the empress and ruled for a while. And Suiko was also in direct blood lineage of this powerful courtier who ordered the assassination. So it was a complete mess. And Kogyoku and Saime, again, this was a single person who took on the throne twice. She took on the throne for the first time because there were 2 competing candidates for the imperial throne. So there were 2 princes, and nobody could make the decision. So she stepped in until the issue was resolved, and eventually conceded to her brother, Kotoku, in 642. But when her brother died, quite prematurely, she again took the throne because there were another multiple contenders for the position. And Jito, on the other hand, right here, she was again a daughter of the emperor and a wife of another emperor, so a very prestigious queen consort. When her husband died, her son was actually died very young too. So in order to wait for her grandson to grow up, she took on the imperial post. And the Genmei and Gensho are actually related to Jito, and they took on the imperial position again to wait for their son or grandson to mature so that they are preserving the imperial lineage within their family line. So how was Shōtoku different? Contrary to this convention, Princess Abe, who later ruled as Koken between 749 to 758, and again as Shōtoku between 764 and 770, was formally appointed as the heir to the throne in 738 at the age of 21 by her father and then Emperor Shomu. Shomu conceded the throne to Princess Abe in 749 when he took the Buddhist tonsure and became a retired emperor. So just to clarify, when a woman takes up the throne in emergency situation, there is no formal designation of princess heir, right, or prince heir to the throne, and she just becomes the empress. Defying every expectation, the empress never married. Koken Shōtoku never married, and in fact, following her father's footstep, she even took the tonsure in 762 to become the first ever sovereign nun. Her reign was rocky, to say the least, because there were many within the imperial court who did not recognize her legitimacy. She even had to concede the throne in 758 to her distant kin Junnin. The year 764, when the empress vowed to construct the Hyakumantō pagoda, was also the year she reclaimed the throne from Junnin. So in her discussion of nunhood in Japan of slightly later period, between Heian into medieval period, Lori Meeks characterizes renunciation of the secular world for women as a retirement from their reproductive duties. The fact that Princess Abe ascended to the throne following the imperial protocol established for exclusively for male heir, then remained unmarried as a nun throughout her reign, and even after she returned to the throne the second time in 764, in essence makes Shōtoku basically a male ruler in the body of a woman. Finally, Shōtoku was also unprecedented because she refused to appoint an imperial heir during her reign. To compensate, she relied almost obsessively on the signs of divine intervention from both Buddhist deities and domestic gods to legitimize her rule. For instance, in the years after she reclaimed the throne in 764, she put down the coup by her kin, and she reclaimed the throne, overthrowing the Emperor Junnin. There were multiple reports of sighting of white pheasants, white crows, white sparrow, white deer, and a white turtle, all of which were considered auspicious signs, evidencing that heaven approved of the emperor's reign. Because Shōtoku's vested interest in divine signs, those opposed to her reign also engaged with the divine rhetoric to counter her claims for legitimacy. The most significant opposition to Shōtoku's reign concerned her relationship with a Buddhist monk named Dokyo. Her devout devotion to Dokyo gave him an unprecedented political authority that eventually threatened the imperial lineage. As the master of early esoteric Buddhism, Dokyo was most likely the one who recommended Shōtoku the Hyakumantō project. Tantalizingly, in 766, while the Hyakumantō project was progressing in full throttle, a disciple of Dokyo miraculously attained 3 pieces of the relics of the Buddha as he prayed to the guardian deity of the north, Bishamon. This event prompted Shōtoku to grant Dokyo the title of the Dharma King, Ho-o. Unusual for this sort of reporting of a miraculous event that was essentially a performance, 2 years later in 768, this finding of the relics was revealed to be false. Dokyo's disciple was accused of deception and banished from the capital. This incident is interesting because in China and on Korean Peninsula, as soon as it was translated into Chinese in 704, the great Dharani of the pure immaculate light began serving as the new foundation for the relic worship. That was intimately linked to the belief in its efficacy to protect the state. The example on the slide you see here is the outer container of a nested reliquary discovered from the temple called Hwamboksa, which comes with a relief of 99 small stupas following the great Dharani of the pure immaculate light. The reliquary contained 4 pieces of relics of the Buddha that King Songjong prepared in 706 to commemorate the death of King Simon Hyosa and Queen Simmok, and also to pray for the divine blessing for his own rule. And this reliquary was emplaced in the pagoda, full-size pagoda, together with a copy of the Great Dharani of the Pure Immaculate Light. Returning to Nara, Japan, Shōtoku was never implicated in the relic discovery scandal. However, it is likely that the Empress carried out the Hyakumantō project, perceiving it as one, if not the, source of the auspicious signs affirming her political legitimacy. So to conclude, when Shōtoku died in 770, a new male emperor from a different imperial blood lineage was immediately put to the throne, right? Ascended to throne. And this event happened with the demonstration of heavenly approval with the discovery of another white turtle. And Dokyo was banished immediately to a temple far, far away from the capital, and thus ended the Shōtoku's reign. The short period of her reign thus can be characterized as the period of divine war. It is telling that the new coins she produced were named Jinku Kaiho, which means God's work opens treasures. For Hyakumantō, the sutra does promise that the Dharani will have efficacy in releasing the dead from terrible fate and atoning for one's sins, just as mentioned in the Chronicle of Japan continued. However, based on Shōtoku's concerns, I believe it is more important that the sutra also promises that all gods and spirits, not just Buddhist guardian deities, will protect whoever copy or recite the Dharani. As Mimiho, Yampuksawan, and others already comment, the Chronicle of Japan continued presents Shōtoku as a negative example of the imperial rule, and its mention of the Hyakumantō project is also almost suspiciously terse. Empress Shōtoku passed away only 4 months after the conclusion of the Hyakumantō project. One cannot help but to wonder if the contemporaneous records might have portrayed this project differently had she lived a little while longer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Walley. And I'm sure we all learned quite a bit from your presentation. And I know I have a few questions. I don't see any questions yet from anyone, but while we're waiting to see if any students have questions or anyone else, I did have two. One is not a question from me, and one is from me. The one that's from the one that is from me, you talked a lot about the possible technology of the printing and a little bit about the script style, I'm curious about the paper. Can you say anything about the paper that the dareni are printed on?
Yes. So the paper, there has been a lot of kind of reconstructive study on what kind of paper that was used. And as far as we know, for the most part, it used mulberry paper, which becomes the standard material for paper in Japan. But what people comment is how thick the paper is. Yeah. And in some cases, they are even very uneven. So that probably caused some challenge when they were used for printing. And the fact that for many of the incantation, the darkest ink and the pooling happens at the top and the bottom, probably because when they were trying to pull the paper off the plate or woodblock, the center part came off first, leaving the rest sort of double printing, right, in a way. So, and for early paper, one thing that was commonly done, and it seems like it was also done in part for the Hyakumantō project too, is to add a gumpy as part, sort of mixed with mulberry. And that allowed for the paper to be a little bit softer and easier to write.
And there was a related question, so I'm glad that I asked that. And there's another question from one of our students. Did Shōtoku have to work extra hard to prove the legitimacy of her reign?
Oh, yes. So, it depends on what you mean by work, right? I mean, it's so interesting to read the Chronicle of Japan Continued, Shoku Nihongi, of her period, because she is having to constantly issue an edict saying you cannot just assume claim that you are an imperial son, right? There are people who came out of the woodwork saying, I am Shomu, her father's son, so I have the legitimate claim to the imperial throne. And a lot of courtiers in the imperial court were saying, constantly wanting to prop up, right, other princes to replace her. So in that sense, she had to, maneuver the political minefield, right? And she did it in a way very gracefully and very powerfully. And the idea of her as a nun was also a sticking point, right? That she did not even clarify who is going to take over her if she dies. And, for her, it, in one sense makes sense, because the sooner she does it, there is a very good chance that she will be removed or even assassinated. So that too was a strategic point. But the way she worked, she actually had a vision, right? Some of it was inherited from her father, who was also very keen on using Buddhism as the new foundation for state establishing. Right. And the way Shomu conceded the throne to Princess Abe, while he was still, active and healthy, well, he wasn't a very healthy person to begin with, but active, was in one sense a demonstration on how a Buddhist ideal could be implemented to state management. So the fact that she was a woman was a key point for Shomu's ideal. And, Shōtoku sort of took that to heart and really tried to carry it forward. And, to the point of appointing an advisor, right? A monk and an advisor of a high rank. And that, rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. So yes, so the short answer is yes. She really had to work hard.
So there's one kind of short question. So a student asked, so you have 700 of the pagoda produced a day. So are there estimates for how many workers that would entail?
Yeah, so the estimate is that 420 or so needed if you were to create 700 per day, right? So 140 stations, and each station needed to have a carver and 2 people to maneuver the lathe because it was, man handled. That sounded wrong, but anyway, so that calculates to 420, and we know quite a bit actually in terms of the making of the wood pagoda, because of excavation and also the inscriptions that were made. 90% of the pagoda that remain today have some sort of inscription on it, and it says that the worker had their name on, but in addition to the name, it put the word left and right. And that probably means that there were at least 2 workshops, the left workshop,
right.
The left of the capital, and the right workshop. And the incomplete pagoda is also discovered within the imperial palace compound. So the suspicion is that at least one of the workshops, if not both, were within the imperial palace compound.
Well, that makes sense. And the way things are usually done spatially during Asuka Nara, that also makes sense.
Yeah.
Another question from a student, which I think is kind of interesting. So you showed the list of the sort of divination predictions that Shōtoku was referring to, with a list of white animals, crows and cows and so on. And the student wonders which is most significant? Are they both significant, the color white or the kind of animal?
Both. Color white, yes. Color white is kind of a must. The albino, right? It's basically an albino. Different animals were considered to be auspicious, but the kind of animal was also very important. And it's interesting, and this is how serious she took these, right? Once the report comes up and these animals were found, she actually had people look these animals up to determine what it meant and what rank of auspiciousness they had. And she incorporated them in different quotes of different Chinese manuscripts within her decree, when she was announcing these auspicious discoveries. And the ones that are particularly interesting are the pheasants. So there were 2 occasions that pheasants were found, and pheasants were understood to be, in this context, a sign of loyalty of her subject, right? Which is a very key concern for her. And the other that is important is the turtle. And it indicates longevity. Yeah.
So before we go on, I have a question that I know the answer, but I'm not sure that most of my students do, because I didn't cover it in this particular class yet. But we're talking about miniature pagodas, and I'm wondering if you could just briefly explain the evolution of the stupa in India and what that is to the pagoda in Japan.
Sure. So Buddhism, as you may know, started in India, right? There was a prince, sort of a regional prince named Gautama Siddhartha, who liked to think a lot, and he sort of came up with a solution, right, to the suffering of the world. And eventually Gautama passes away. And because the Buddha was following the Indian custom at that time, he was cremated. So for Buddhism, unlike Christianity, for instance, for Buddhism, the earliest and most important object of veneration was the actual bodily remain of the Buddha. And the stupa, which was a mound, a funerary mound that was built for the Buddha. So that's sort of the beginning of stupa. And these funerary mounds were made for different people, but in India, as in many other cultures, death was considered to be defiled, right? And not, nothing that you want to get close to. But in Buddhism, it was different, because Shakyamuni, in many of the scriptures, he gives, the instructions are given in his words, right? And one of the things Shakyamuni said was, once I pass away, do the funerary procession and the cremation process equal to the wheel turning king, right? So the imperial kingly funeral, right? And once the cremation is done, build the stupa at the crossroad. So what that means is he wanted the stupa to be in place where many people could come and venerate. So it became kind of a focal point. And this importance of stupa, as well as the relics of the Buddha, travel as the Buddhism travel across, to east. So it became an important aspect in China, in Korea, and also in Japan. But it's interesting because it's this sort of idea, right? When it transmits, it starts to pick up things as it moves through the geographic region. So the stupa, which was initially just a kind of a inverted bowl-like mound, changed shape as it moved through China by being combined with, people think more like a watchtower-like multi-story structure, so that it gained height and sort of grandeur. And that's the kind of structure that came into Korean Peninsula and also to Japanese archipelago. And pagoda is kind of a made-up word that means, that refers to that structure.
So in my class, I do a whole lecture just on Suiko and not so much on Shōtoku. And one of the things that, is sort of interesting for scholars now is to look at what these female emperors accomplished and did. And some of us tried to make the distinction between empresses who were simply consorts by calling them female emperors, because they were tenno, or the ruler, not the consort. So that's the preferred term that I use in my class. So for Shōtoku, there's also, a lot of her accomplishments in earlier history were attributed to male kinspeople. So I'm wondering if you could just briefly, what were some of her other political or, cultural accomplishments aside from helping to spread Buddhism?
Yeah, so first of all, I completely agree about the terminology. It's a little bit difficult. The one I prefer now is sovereign, rather than, I just use emperor to refer to everybody, but that seems to be a little bit problematic too. So the word I use is sovereign. But yes, so in terms of her achievements, so as I mentioned, she had 2 terms, right, of imperial reign. And the first one, in many respects, was taken up by sort of carrying forward her father's project. For instance, Emperor Shomu was the one who came up with this idea to create this grand, Great East Temple, or Todaiji, and the colossal bronze Vairocana, Buddhist statue, right? But the project did not finish before he passed away. So Kogen took up the slack, and she was the one who really nudged everybody to finish the project. So that was one great accomplishment she did. And You know, the second term, unfortunately, really, when you read the chronicle, it really feels like she was putting out fire, right, all around, because it was the terrible time of famine, flood, and drought, flood and drought, and also
pestilence,
earthquake,
fires.
So it was really, and plus she had to deal with, you know, she was instrumental, right, in putting down the coup. So in that respect, it was very much trying to like pull everything together and sort of keep it under her ideological, you know, progress that she wants to make, right? So in that respect, it is very difficult to kind of tease out her accomplishments. But, you know, the way in which she incorporated Buddhism to her reign is very much taken after Uzutian, the only female emperor, right, in China that ruled towards about like, you know, towards the beginning of the 8th century. And that sort of idea of actively engaging with Buddhism seems to become kind of a norm, right, after her period, and used to the advantage of the whoever the ruler is. So in that respect, that could be kind of visionary.
Great. So maybe sort of related question from another person, which I'm going to rephrase a little bit. But so you showed that very interesting slide of Shōtoku's, you know, sort of the omens and signs that she would refer to. And the question is, was she particularly interested in that sort of divination and omens and religious signs? Or were all rulers, male or female, equally interested in those sorts of things?
Yes. So this idea of yin yang and divination really start to come in during the reign of Emperor Tenmu. So sort of a few generations up, right? Koken. And Shōtoku. But from the reading I've been doing, Shōtoku was particularly interested, and she, in fact, as in her first term as Koken, she even issued a decree saying we need to re-emphasize, right, astrology. We need to emphasize yin yang study. We need to emphasize
Myodo in
Myodo, yes,
Myodo.
and we need to emphasize divination. So it was something that she was very much concerned about. And so I think it is not incorrect to say that she had more of an interest in this than others. And also, it's so interesting during, you know, her reign as Shōtoku, the second term, there was also an incident of a woman who, you know, clearly did not agree with Shōtoku, right? She snuck into the imperial palace for the purpose of cursing Empress Shōtoku, so female Emperor Shōtoku, and you know, she says she was able to catch her, and the curse didn't work, and thank goodness, right? So yeah, and that's sort of what I mean by the divine war, that everybody seemed to be kind of engaged in this rhetoric because Shōtoku was so concerned about it.
Yeah. So there, another sort of question going back to the paper, and you mentioned it was mulberry paper, and so the question is, what you had the insect damage. Can you guess what kind of insects were eating that paper?
Well, that's a good question. I actually haven't looked into it, but from what I read or heard, it has something to do with the sizing that the insects particularly like. Yeah. And I just assumed that it's the shibi, right? What is that? The silverfish?
Yeah.
Silvertail, yeah. So the bookworm basically
Yes.
was my guess, but I actually haven't confirmed.
I thought it was an interesting question.
Yeah.
So this question, are there estimates of the share of the GOP of the day that the 1 million pagodas took?
Oh, well, people at the time complained that it took too much.
I imagine they did.
Yeah, because we have to, think about even the wood, right?
Yes.
I mentioned that the body part of the pagoda used Japanese cypress,
Yeah.
but in order to
Okay.
make that using single wood, you have to avoid the core because
Yes.
otherwise it'll split, right? So that means the wood has to be of quite a substantial
big one.
size.
Yeah.
Yeah, in order to take out the core, but still have enough
Yeah.
wood left to make that.
Right. That is really something. So I think there are no more questions that I see right now. And we are just, maybe 5 or 10 minutes before the end. And so do you have any last comments? And, then we'll let you rest.
Yeah, so you mentioned you had 2 questions, but I'm not sure if you asked both. One was the
okay.
one.
What was the other one? I think it was the paper.
Oh, okay.
The paper, and then explain pagoda for people who don't know what a pagoda is actually. So we're in Asuka Nara period in the course now, and then we'll move on to Heian period. So I'll be talking a lot about Omyodo and Omyoji, Abe no Seimei for the Heian period. But it's good. I think it was good that you brought up that she was interested in Omyodo because it sort of prefaces what we're going to be looking at. One more question, I think here. Let's see. What was the environmental impact of the building and placement of the pagodas? I'm assuming that this means the real pagodas, like at Horyuji, not the Hyakumantō. I think the question is not about Hyakumantō, but actual pagodas such as the one at Horyuji. Any environmental impact that you know about that?
Environmental impact, I'm not sure what the person who asked mean by, but one can think of it in multiple different ways. Buddhist architecture was completely new, right? There was no such thing as multi-story pagoda until Buddhism came in. So in a way, it completely changed the topography, right, of Japan, yes, as people were learning about what Buddhism meant. So there's one, that way one can think about, but because it was such a tall building with a metal finial on top, it was basically a lightning rod. So it was a lot of fire, and fire is the #1 cause of, disaster in Japan. That's another way to think about it. But in terms of the impact to the environment, I mean, these were all, post and lintel timber frame architecture, right? And it requires a lot of wood, and particularly in the early building, because it was such a complicated construction, you couldn't treat the wood too much because your joining technique was not sophisticated enough, right? So you're using these massive Japanese cypresses to create this building. And, we know that by Kamakura period, when Todaiji was going through rebuilding, they had a very difficult time securing wood, right? So the same kind of issues that we see today were already present.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of related things that we could go into, but I think that we should take this opportunity to release you from teaching us so much. I mean, I know that I learned so much from your comments and I'll actually follow up with some things that I want to ask you later, but I hope that everyone will join me to thank Professor Akiko Walley and her marvelous presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me once again. Thank you,
Yes.
everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.